In the world of the ultra-rich, divorce is a blood sport. For millionaire tech mogul Tobias Granger, his was supposed to be a clean kill. His pregnant wife, Coraline, was painted as unstable, and his beautiful young mistress, Zoe, was already measuring the drapes for the penthouse. On the morning of the court hearing that would financially cripple Coraline, she simply vanished. The police suspected she fled. Tobias's lawyers called it a stunt. Zoe just smirked, tasting victory, but they all underestimated the woman they tried to erase. Because a single letter was about to arrive, and the secrets it held wouldn't just cost Tobias his money, they would detonate his entire world. The air in the penthouse apartment atop the St. Regis Tower in Chicago was different. It was thinner, cleaner, filtered not just by state-of-the-art HVAC systems, but by the sheer altitude of wealth. From the 62nd floor, the city below was a silent, glittering map of Tobias Granger's success. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, a tumbler of Macallan 25 in his hand, watching the river carve its path through the concrete and steel canyons he had, in his own way, conquered. At 38, Tobias was the architect of his own universe. His company, Granger Capital, had started as a fintech venture in a cramped office in the Loop and was now a behemoth in algorithmic trading, its tendrils wrapped around Wall Street and the City of London. He had the sharp jawline, the piercing blue eyes, and the custom-tailored Tom Ford suits that screamed success. He was a man who didn't believe in luck, only in leverage, and he applied it to every aspect of his life, including his marriage. Coraline Mercer, now Coraline Granger, had been there from the beginning. She was the brilliant software engineer who had co-written the initial code for his first successful algorithm. She was the one who worked 18-hour days alongside him, fueled by cheap coffee and a shared dream. She was the steady, grounding force to his volatile ambition. Where he saw numbers and risk, she saw patterns and people. They were a perfect team and for a long time, a perfect couple. Her quiet strength was the scaffolding upon which he'd built his empire. But empires have a way of making their builders forget the foundations. As the billions rolled in, the quiet strength that had once been Coraline's greatest asset began to look, in Tobias's eyes, like a lack of dynamism. Her preference for a quiet dinner at their favorite Italian place in Lincoln Park over a high-profile gala felt like an anchor. Her contentment with their life felt like a lack of ambition. He had evolved, he told himself. He was a shark now, and she was still content to swim in the shallows. 7 years into their marriage, with Coraline 5 months pregnant with their first child, a child they had both desperately wanted for years, the first cracks had shattered into a chasm. The cause of that chasm had a name: Zoe Chandler. Zoe was 26, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes that held a calculated innocence. She'd been hired as Tobias's executive assistant and had quickly proven her value went far beyond managing his schedule. She anticipated his needs, laughed at his jokes, and looked at him with an undisguised adoration that Coraline's tired, knowing gaze no longer held. Zoe was exciting. She was a reflection of the man he saw himself as now, a titan of industry who deserved to have his every whim catered to. The affair began, as they often do, with late nights at the office, shared confidences over expensive dinners charged to the corporate card, and a clandestine weekend trip to Miami under the guise of a fintech conference. Coraline wasn't stupid. She saw the shift in Tobias, the way he suddenly guarded his phone, the scent of a different perfume, Chanel Chance, so unlike her own subtle Joe Malone, clinging to his suits. The emotional distance that had grown into a palpable coldness. The final, brutal confirmation came from a credit card statement she'd opened by mistake, a charge for a suite at the Satai Hotel, and another, more damning one, from a jeweler called Graf for a diamond tennis bracelet she knew he hadn't bought for her. The confrontation was uglier than anything she could have imagined. It happened in the same living room where Tobias now stood admiring his kingdom. "How could you, Tobias?" Coraline's voice was hoarse, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. The credit card statement lay on the marble coffee table between them. With our baby on the way? Tobias, to her horror, didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. He looked relieved, as if she had finally given him the opening he'd been waiting for. "Coraline, let's not be dramatic," he said, his tone chillingly calm. Things haven't been right between us for a long time. We both know that. Things haven't been right because you've been sleeping with your assistant. She cried, the betrayal of physical pain in her chest. Her name is Zoe, he corrected, as if that mattered. And she understands me. She understands my life, the pressures I'm under. She understands your wallet, Coraline shot back, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I was there, Tobias. I built this with you. I wrote the lines of code that made you your first million while you were out charming investors. Does she know that? This is exactly what I'm talking about, he said, waving a dismissive hand. You're always living in the past. You're holding me back. Zoe sees the future. She sees me for who I am now. The conversation devolved from there. In the weeks that followed, Tobias, with Zoe's venomous whispers in his ear, transformed into a monster Coraline didn't recognize. Zoe expertly painted Coraline as a bitter, jealous woman, clinging to a past he had outgrown. She suggested that Coraline had trapped him with the pregnancy, a lie so vile it took Coraline's breath away. Tobias, his ego masterfully stroked by Zoe, absorbed it all. He moved out of the penthouse and into a suite at the Waldorf Astoria. Within a week, his lawyer, a notoriously ruthless shark named Garrett Sloan, had served Coraline with divorce papers. The terms were an insult. He offered her a one-time payout that was less than the value of his watch collection. He claimed that the vast majority of his fortune was tied up in premarital assets and corporate structures that she had no claim to. His legal team began preparing a case to paint her as emotionally unstable, her pregnancy hormones making her irrational, all in a bid to deny her any significant portion of the Granger capital empire. They demanded full financial discovery from her, while simultaneously burying her lawyer, Rebecca Shaw, in mountains of obfuscating paperwork from their end. The battle lines were drawn. On one side was Tobias, with his billions, his high-powered legal team, and his adoring mistress. On the other was Coraline, 5 months pregnant, emotionally shattered, with only her principled but outgunned lawyer and the undeniable truth on her side. The court date was set, a preliminary hearing to rule on freezing a portion of Tobias's assets to cover Coraline's legal fees and living expenses, pending the final divorce settlement. It was a critical, must-win battle for Coraline. Without those funds, Tobias could bleed her dry in legal fees, forcing her to accept his pathetic offer. Tobias swirled the last of the amber liquid in his glass. He felt a pang of something. Not guilt, he told himself, but a flicker of annoyance. It was all so messy. If Coraline had just been reasonable, if she had just accepted that their time was over, it wouldn't have to be this way. But she was being difficult, stubborn, just as she'd always been. His phone buzzed, a text from Zoe. Thinking of you. Can't wait until this is all over and we can finally start our real life. I love you. So a smile touched Tobias's lips. Zoe was his future, sleek, shiny, and uncomplicated. Coraline was the past, a debt he was about to settle for pennies on the dollar. Tomorrow in court, Garrett Sloan would tear Coraline's claims apart. He would suggest she was a spendthrift, that she was hiding assets of her own. He would win. He always did. Tobias placed the empty glass down with a decisive click. Tomorrow, the final chapter of his old life would end, and a better one would begin. He had no idea how right and how devastatingly wrong he was. The morning of the court hearing dawned gray and oppressive, a thick blanket of clouds pressing down on Chicago. Rain lashed against the windows of Rebecca Shaw's office on the 20th floor of a LaSalle Street building. It was a respectable address, but a world away from the gleaming towers housing Granger Capital or Garrett Sloan's law firm. Rebecca checked her watch for the 10th time in as many minutes. 8:45 a.m. The hearing was at 9:30 a.m. at the Daily Center. Coraline should have been there 30 minutes ago. Try her again, Sophie, Rebecca said, her voice tight with anxiety. Sophie Mercer, Coraline's younger sister, was pacing a hole in the carpet. Her face was pale, her brown hair pulled back in a messy knot. She had flown in from Denver the moment Coraline had called her, sobbing, after being served the divorce papers. She clutched her phone, hitting redial. It's still going straight to voicemail, Sophie said, her voice trembling. This isn't like her, Rebecca. Not today. She knew how important this was. We talked at 10 p.m. last night. She was nervous, but she was ready. She said, I just have to be brave for one more day. Rebecca's mind raced through the possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had Tobias's team intimidated her? Had the stress become too much? Coraline was pregnant, vulnerable. Garrett Sloan is a snake, Rebecca muttered mostly to herself. He's not above dirty tricks. Maybe they sent someone to talk to her, to scare her into not showing up. Would Tobias do that? Sophie asked, her eyes wide with fear. The Tobias you knew? Maybe not. The Tobias who was being advised by Garrett Sloan and whispered to by that homewrecker? I wouldn't put anything past him. At 9:15 a.m., with a knot of dread in her stomach, Rebecca knew they couldn't wait any longer. All right, we have to go. Maybe she got stuck in traffic. Maybe her phone died. Maybe she went straight to the courthouse. We have to be there. They arrived at the Daly Center courthouse just as the court officer was calling the case. Granger versus Granger, courtroom 1904, Judge Ann Wesley presiding. Rebecca and Sophie hurried inside. The courtroom was paneled in dark wood, imposing and formal. At the plaintiff's table sat Tobias Granger, looking impeccable in a navy suit. Beside him, Garrett Sloan was a vision of smug confidence, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his briefcase open and papers neatly arranged. Tobias scanned the courtroom, his eyes briefly landing on Rebecca and Sophie. He registered Coraline's absence, and a flicker of something, annoyance, triumph, crossed his face before being replaced by a mask of neutral concern. All parties present? Judge Wesley asked, a stern woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense reputation. Rebecca stood, her heart pounding. Your Honor, Rebecca Shaw for the respondent, Coraline Granger. My client is not yet present. We believe she may be delayed. Garrett Sloan rose smoothly to his feet. Your Honor, Garrett Sloan for the petitioner, Tobias Granger. Frankly, we find the respondent's absence highly convenient. And what do you mean by that, Mr. Sloan? The judge asked, her eyes narrowing. Your Honor, Sloan began, his voice oozing insincere sympathy. My client has been subjected to a number of baseless and inflammatory accusations. We have reason to believe that the respondent, perhaps realizing the weakness of her case for exorbitant preliminary support, has orchestrated this little no-show as a dramatic stunt, a ploy for sympathy, or perhaps an attempt to delay the proceedings she knows she will lose. Objection, Rebecca snapped. That is pure speculation and an outrageous attack on my client's character. Is it? Sloan countered, turning slightly to address the judge. We have financial records showing Mrs. Granger has been spending lavishly in the past weeks. We were also preparing to motion for a substance screening, given some concerning reports about her emotional state. Perhaps she fled to avoid such a test. Sophie gasped from the gallery, a strangled sob escaping her lips. It was a lie, a disgusting, calculated lie. Coraline hadn't touched a drop of alcohol since learning she was pregnant, let alone anything else. Tobias sat impassively, staring straight ahead. He was letting Sloan do the dirty work, painting the mother of his unborn child as an unstable, drug-addled gold digger. Judge Wesley banged her gavel once. That's enough, Mr. Sloan. Your motion is not before this court, and I'll thank you not to poison the well. Ms. Shaw, you have 30 minutes to locate your client. If she is not here by 10:15, I will be forced to dismiss your motion for temporary relief and will consider a motion for sanctions from Mr. Sloan for wasting the court's time. The 30 minutes were agony. Rebecca and Sophie made frantic calls from the hallway. They called Coraline's phone 100 times. They called the concierge at her new apartment building in River North. He confirmed her car, a modest Lexus SUV, was still in the garage. He hadn't seen her leave that morning. They called local hospitals, their voices cracking with fear, asking for any Jane Does or patients named Coraline Granger. Nothing. At 10:15, they had to face the judge again. Ms. Shaw? Judge Wesley's voice was grim. Your Honor, Rebecca said, her own voice unsteady. We have been unable to reach my client. We believe she may be in some kind of distress. This is completely out of character. We are deeply concerned for her safety. Your concern is noted, the judge said, though her tone was skeptical. However, this is a court of law, not a police station. Based on your client's failure to appear, I have no choice but to deny the motion for temporary asset seizure and spousal support. Mr. Sloan, if you wish to file your motion for sanctions, I will review it. Thank you, Your Honor, Sloan said, a predatory smile touching his lips. As the judge banged the gavel, dismissing the session, Tobias Granger stood up. He adjusted his tie, turned to Garrett Sloan, and gave him a firm, approving nod. He didn't even glance towards Sophie, whose face was streaked with tears. He simply turned and walked out of the courtroom, a free man, his billions secure. Outside the courthouse, the rain had intensified. In a black Cadillac Escalade waiting at the curb, Zoe Chandler watched Tobias emerge. She had been parked across the street, unable to resist seeing the outcome for herself. She saw him walk out, confident and victorious. She saw the distraught figures of Coraline's lawyer and sister follow moments later. A slow, triumphant smirk spread across Zoe's face. It was over. The pregnant wife was gone, discredited, and out of the picture. She had played her hand perfectly, manipulating Tobias, isolating him from his past, and guiding him to this exact outcome. The penthouse, the name, the fortune, it was all hers now. She pulled out her phone and sent a text to Tobias. See? I told you it would all work out. You're finally free. Let's celebrate tonight. Caviar and champagne at the apartment? She watched as he read the message, a small smile forming on his face before he slid into his own waiting car. Zoe leaned back against the plush leather seats of the Escalade. She felt a thrill, a giddy rush of power. She had won. Coraline Mercer was nothing more than a ghost, a bad memory that was already starting to fade. The first 24 hours after Coraline's disappearance were a blur of police reports and terrified speculation. Sophie, staying in Coraline's eerily silent apartment, filed a missing persons report. The initial police response was lukewarm. Detective Morrison, a world-weary cop with 20 years on the force, had seen this 100 times. Look, Ms. Mercer, he said, his tone laced with practiced patience. It's a nasty divorce. A lot of money on the line. 99 times out of 100, the person just took off. She's probably in a spa in Arizona, trying to make your brother-in-law sweat. She'll turn up when she runs out of money. You don't know my sister, Sophie insisted, her voice raw. She would never, ever risk her baby's health. She would never abandon her fight. Something is wrong. But their narrative was powerful. Tobias's team, through strategic leaks to gossip columns and whispers in the right ears, solidified the story. The unstable pregnant wife had a breakdown and fled. It was tragic, but what could you do? Tobias, they said, was deeply concerned, but also baffled by her erratic behavior. This was the public story. The private one was far uglier. In the days that followed, Zoe moved her things into the St. Regis penthouse. Her designer clothes filled the closets that had once held Coraline's things. Her laughter echoed in rooms that had fallen silent. She and Tobias hosted a small, lavish dinner party for a few of their real friends, celebrating their new beginning. To any observer, Tobias Granger was a man moving on, freed from a burdensome past. But inside, a tiny, cold seed of doubt had been planted in Tobias's mind. Late at night, when Zoe was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even, Tobias found himself staring at the ceiling. He remembered Coraline's steadfastness. He remembered her crying, not with rage, but with genuine, soul-crushing hurt during their last fight. I built this with you, she had screamed. It was true. He tried to reconcile that woman, the partner, the builder, with the unstable runaway Garrett Sloan described. The two images didn't fit. Zoe, ever perceptive, noticed his pensive moods. Don't let her get in your head, honey, she'd murmur, tracing patterns on his chest. She's doing this to manipulate you, to make you feel guilty. That's her only weapon left. I know, he'd say, wanting to believe it. You're right. But the seed of doubt remained. Meanwhile, Rebecca Shaw and Sophie Mercer refused to accept the police's apathy. They pooled their resources, Sophie's savings, a second mortgage on Rebecca's own home, and hired the one person they believed could find the truth, a private investigator named Frank Miller. Frank was the antithesis of the polished world of Tobias Granger. His office was a cramped, dusty space above a tavern in Wicker Park, smelling faintly of stale coffee and rain-soaked wool. He was a former cop who had left the force out of disgust for its bureaucracy. He was in his 50s, with a bulldog's face and eyes that missed nothing. "Tell me everything," he said, leaning back in his creaky chair, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. They told him the whole story: the divorce, the court date, the baby, Zoe Chandler, Garrett Sloane's tactics. Frank listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said when they were done. "The cops think she's a flight risk. Let's start by proving them wrong. Or right. The truth doesn't take sides." Frank's investigation began methodically. He started at Coraline's apartment. He noted the lack of any packed bags. Her passport was in a drawer. Her favorite jewelry, a simple necklace her mother had given her, was on the nightstand. These were not the actions of someone planning a trip. He pulled her financial records. Here the story got murky. He found what the police had found: a single large cash withdrawal of $10,000 made 2 days before she disappeared. This supported the flight theory. He also found a purchase record for a cheap burner phone from a 7-Eleven. Another point for the police's theory. "It looks like she was planning something," Frank told Rebecca and Sophie, his tone grim. "But it might not be what they think." He turned his attention to Zoe Chandler. He ran a deep background check, far more thorough than the one Granger Capital's HR department had done. What he found was a pattern. At 21, Zoe had been involved with a wealthy real estate developer in Miami. The relationship ended when his wife found out, but Zoe walked away with a condo and a significant parting gift. 2 years later, she was in Los Angeles, dating a film producer in his 50s. That relationship ended just before she moved to Chicago and landed the job with Tobias. There were no lawsuits, no overt scandals, just a clear, upwardly mobile trajectory fueled by wealthy married men. She was a professional. The real break came from legwork. Frank spent days canvassing the area around Coraline's apartment, showing her picture, asking questions. Most people hadn't seen anything, but a barista at the Starbucks on the corner remembered her. "Yeah, she came in the morning. She went missing," the young man said. "Real early, around 6:30 a.m. She seemed jumpy, kept looking over her shoulder." But it was the next piece of information that made Frank's pulse quicken. "Someone else was in here too," the barista continued. "A woman, blonde, really dressed up for that time of morning. They didn't talk, but the blonde lady was watching her. Hard, gave me the creeps." Frank showed him a picture of Zoe he'd pulled from her social media. The barista's eyes widened. "Yeah, that's her. That's the woman who was watching her." Zoe had lied. She had told the police and Tobias that she was at her own apartment across town that morning. This was the first concrete crack in her story. Frank's next stop was the security office of Coraline's building. He'd already been told the camera covering the main entrance had been glitching that morning. The concierge claimed it was a known issue. Frank didn't believe in coincidences. He sweet-talked the security guard, a lonely night shifter, with a bottle of decent whiskey and a $100 bill. "The system's old," the guard admitted, taking a sip. "But a glitch that specific, for that precise 2-hour window? Someone with the admin password could have remotely accessed the server and corrupted that specific file." "Who has the password?" Frank asked. "Building management, and the third-party security company that services us, a company called Titan Security Solutions." Frank spent the next 2 days digging into Titan Security Solutions. It was a small, grimy outfit with a less-than-stellar reputation, and when he cross-referenced their ownership records with the financial disclosures from Tobias's company, he found a link. A year prior, Granger Capital had made a quiet investment in a portfolio of small businesses. One of those businesses was Titan Security Solutions. Tobias Granger's company was an investor in the security firm whose camera had mysteriously failed at the exact time and place his wife disappeared. Frank felt a cold chill run down his spine. This wasn't a woman who had run away. This was an organized, deliberate erasure. He focused his efforts on the corrupted video file. He hired a freelance digital forensics expert, a hacker kid who worked out of his parents' basement in Aurora. It would take time and money, but the kid was confident he could recover at least fragments of the footage. While he waited, Frank put together his preliminary findings. the burner phone, the cash withdrawal. It wasn't a plan to flee. It was a plan for a clandestine meeting. Coraline was going to meet someone, and she didn't want it to be traced. She was scared, and Zoe Chandler had been there that morning watching her. He called Rebecca Shaw. "I think we need to consider a much darker possibility," he said, his voice low. "I don't think Coraline ran. I think she was taken, and I think Zoe Chandler was involved." The thread was unraveling, and Frank had a terrible feeling it led directly back to the gleaming penthouse on the 62nd floor. 2 weeks after Coraline's disappearance, Tobias Granger was beginning to feel invincible. The police had officially classified Coraline's case as a non-suspicious voluntary absence, effectively closing the active investigation. Garrett Sloan had successfully argued in court that since Coraline had abandoned her legal claim by disappearing, all temporary motions were void. The Granger empire was secure. Zoe was planning a lavish trip to St. Bart's to get away from all this stress. Tobias was sitting in his expansive office at Granger Capital. The skyline of Chicago spread before him like a conquered territory. He was reviewing quarterly projections, the numbers a soothing balm to the lingering, nagging thoughts about Coraline. He had almost convinced himself of the narrative. She had buckled under the pressure. She was weak. He was strong. That was the natural order of things. His new executive assistant, a nervous young man who was terrified of him, knocked softly on the door. "Sir, a courier just delivered this for you. It's marked strictly personal and confidential." The assistant placed a crisp, cream-colored envelope on the polished mahogany desk. It was heavy, made of expensive cardstock. There was no return address, only his name and office address typed in a simple, elegant font. Curious, Tobias slid it open with a silver letter opener. Inside were two things, a single key and a one-page letter. The letterhead was from a law firm he'd never heard of, Chen and Associates. He began to read. "Mr. Granger, this correspondence concerns your pending divorce from our client, Coraline Mercer Granger. We trust this letter finds you well." Tobias scoffed. His wife, the runaway, had a new lawyer. Some unknown ambulance chaser named Chen. This was pathetic. He continued reading, a smirk playing on his lips. "It has come to our attention, through documentation provided by our client, that you have engaged in a systematic and fraudulent effort to conceal marital assets in advance of your divorce proceedings. We are in possession of evidence detailing the creation of 3 shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands: Apex Global Holdings, Nautilus Ventures, and Orion International. Between April and June of this year." Tobias's smirk vanished. His blood ran cold. Those were the exact entities he and his private wealth manager had set up to shield the most liquid portions of his recent earnings. It was a contingency plan created on Zoe's paranoid insistence that Coraline would try to take everything. How could she possibly know about them? Only he, his wealth manager, and Garrett Sloan were aware of those names. He read on, his hands trembling slightly. "Furthermore, we have documented wire transfers totaling approximately $85 million from Granger Capital accounts to these offshore entities. We also have copies of encrypted emails between you and Miss Zoe Chandler, in which you explicitly discuss the strategy of transferring these funds to minimize Coraline's potential claim. In one such email, dated May 12th, Ms. Chandler refers to it as our nest egg, and you reply, she'll never find it." Tobias felt the air leave his lungs. He could picture the exact email. It had been sent from his personal account, the one he thought was secure. How? How could she have gotten it? "Our client, Mrs. Granger, began to suspect your infidelity in subsequent financial machinations several months ago. The burner phone and the cash withdrawal that your legal team has so effectively used to paint her as a fugitive were in fact tools she used to procure this evidence without your knowledge. She is far more resourceful than you ever gave her credit for." The room suddenly felt hot, suffocating. He thought back. Coraline, a gifted coder. She knew his systems inside and out. Had she built a back door into their network years ago? Had she been monitoring him all this time, playing the part of the unsuspecting wife while she gathered ammunition? The idea was terrifying. It was brilliant. The letter's final paragraphs were the masterstroke. "This letter and the enclosed key are a courtesy. The key is to a safety deposit box at a Northern Trust branch on Wacker Drive. Inside, you will find a hard drive containing the complete unredacted evidence package. Consider it a preview. A second identical hard drive has already been delivered to a trusted third party. Per our client's instructions, if we do not receive confirmation from you within 48 hours that you are prepared to meet our terms, that hard drive, along with a detailed explanatory narrative, will be forwarded simultaneously to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. The charges would include, but not be limited to, corporate fraud, tax evasion, and perjury. Our terms are simple. First, you will immediately fire Garrett Sloan and cease all public and private disparagement of Mrs. Granger. Second, you will fund a private, no-expense-spared investigation into her disappearance, led by an investigator of our choosing. Third, you will agree to a divorce settlement amounting to 50% of all marital assets, including the $85 million currently held offshore. This is non-negotiable. You tried to erase your wife, Mr. Granger. Instead, she has given you a choice. You can face a fair and equitable divorce, or you can face federal prison. The clock is ticking. Sincerely, David Chen. David Chen. The name suddenly clicked, hitting Tobias like a physical blow. David Chen wasn't just some random lawyer. He was Tobias's first business partner. The brilliant strategist Tobias had forced out with a lowball offer 10 years ago, just before Granger Capital exploded. He had screwed David over, building his empire on the groundwork David had laid. And Coraline had known that. She had known how much David hated him. She hadn't just found a lawyer, she had found the one man on earth who would take more pleasure in destroying Tobias Granger than anyone. Tobias stared at the letter, his entire world tilting on its axis. The smug confidence he had felt just minutes ago had evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. Coraline hadn't run. She hadn't broken down. She had set a trap, a perfect, inescapable trap. And all this time he had been dancing in the palm of her hand, manipulated not by Coraline's weakness, but by his own arrogance and the whispers of the woman sitting in his penthouse right now. Zoe, our nest egg. Zoe had been complicit in the very fraud that was now being used as a guillotine over his head. The letter wasn't a plea from a victim. It was a checkmate from a queen. And as Tobias looked at the small, innocuous key sitting on his desk, he realized the game was over. He had already lost. The only question now was how much more he was willing to sacrifice before admitting it. Tobias drove from his office back to the St. Regis penthouse in a daze. The city lights blurred into streaks of neon and white. The letter from David Chen felt like a block of ice in his gut. The meticulous plan, the quiet rage behind it. It was so undeniably Coraline. The Coraline he had first met. The one who could see 10 moves ahead on a chessboard. The one whose intellect he had once admired above all else. He had forgotten that woman, replacing her with a caricature of his own making. He let himself into the penthouse. The sound of pop music and light, airy laughter drifted from the living area. Zoe was there, on the phone, one leg tucked under her on the white leather sofa. She was wearing a silk robe, a glass of champagne in her hand. "No, St. Bart's, for at least 2 weeks. We deserve it," she was saying. "He's finally free of all that drama." She saw Tobias and her face lit up. "Oh, my love is here. I have to go. I'll text you. Bye." She ended the call and glided over to him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Tough day, baby. Let me pour you a glass. We can look at resorts. I'm thinking Cheval Blanc." Her perfume, the Chanel she always wore, suddenly seemed cloying, suffocating. Her smile, which he once found so enchanting, now looked like a predatory baring of teeth. He gently pushed her away. "We need to talk, Zoe." His tone, flat and cold, stopped her short. "What is it? What's wrong?" He walked over to the bar, not to pour a drink, but to have the solid marble between them. He tossed the letter and the key onto the counter. "This arrived today." Zoe picked up the letter, her brow furrowed in confusion. She began to read. Tobias watched her face, a clinical, detached part of his brain observing the process. He saw the initial confusion melt into disbelief, then morph into sheer, unadulterated panic. Her hand began to shake, rattling the ice in her champagne glass. Her face went pale, the carefully applied makeup suddenly looking like a cheap mask. Apex. Nautilus, she whispered, the names of the shell corporations sounding like a curse. How? How did she know? She's smarter than you or I gave her credit for, Tobias said, his voice devoid of emotion. She was 10 steps ahead of us the entire time. She was building a case for federal fraud while we were congratulating ourselves on winning a divorce hearing. This is a bluff, Zoe said, her voice rising in pitch. She's trying to scare us. She's the one who's missing. We have to use that. We tell the police she was trying to blackmail you and then fled. Tobias let out a short, harsh laugh. Use what, Zoe? The narrative we created? The one that's about to be blown to pieces by the SEC and the IRS? They have the wire transfers. They have our emails. Our nest egg, he quoted, his eyes locking onto hers. Remember that? How do you think that will play in a federal courtroom? The mask shattered completely. The cool, confident siren was gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal. No, you can fix this. Your lawyers. Garrett can fix this. Garrett is the first person I have to fire, according to their terms, Tobias stated flatly. And he'd be the first person to turn on me to save his own license. This isn't a divorce case anymore. This is a criminal conspiracy, and you and I, my dear, are the star defendants. Me, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at her own chest. This was your money, your divorce. I was just helping you. I was supporting you. You were encouraging me to commit felonies. Tobias's voice finally rose, the dam of his composure breaking. You were the one who was paranoid about her. You were the one who pushed me to hide the money. You were the one who filled my head with poison about the mother of my child. Because I love you, she sobbed, tears now streaming down her face, carving paths through her foundation. No, you don't, Tobias said, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical impact. You love this, he gestured around the opulent penthouse. You love the idea of being Mrs. Granger, but you never cared about me. Coraline. Coraline cared, and I threw her away for this. As if on cue, Tobias's phone buzzed. It was an email from a sender he didn't recognize. The subject line was, Coraline Granger, recovered footage. His heart hammered against his ribs. He opened the email. It was from Frank Miller, the private investigator. The message was brief. Mr. Granger, your wife's sister hired me. Thought you should see this. The file is attached. It was a video file. He clicked on it. The footage was grainy, time-stamped for 6:45 a.m. on the morning Coraline disappeared. It was from a camera angled down the street from her apartment building. He saw Coraline, wrapped in a coat, walking nervously, looking over her shoulder. Then two burly men in dark jackets intercepted her. They weren't overtly aggressive at first, just blocking her path. Coraline tried to push past them, and then a third figure entered the frame, stepping out from a recessed doorway. A woman with blonde hair, wearing a stylish trench coat. It was Zoe. The video had no sound, but the body language was clear. Zoe was directing them. She was pointing, her expression hard and furious. Coraline looked from the men to Zoe, her face a mask of shock and betrayal. She tried to run. One of the men grabbed her arm. She struggled. The second man joined in, and they quickly, brutally forced her into a dark van that had pulled up to the curb. Zoe watched for a moment, then turned and walked briskly away in the opposite direction, pulling out her phone as she went. The video ended. Tobias looked up from his phone, his face ashen. The blood in his veins had turned to ice water. The lies, the manipulation. It was all so much worse than he had ever imagined. This wasn't just about money. You were there, he whispered, his voice shaking with a rage so profound it was almost silent. The morning she disappeared, you were there. Zoe saw the look on his face and stumbled backward. Tobias, it wasn't supposed to be like that. I swear. I hired them. I hired Titan Security, your company, just to scare her, to tell her to get out of town, to drop the case. They were just supposed to talk to her, rough her up a little maybe. I didn't know they would take her. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. Her confession, tumbling out in a frantic, self-serving rush, was the final horrifying piece of the puzzle. The corrupted security footage, the conveniently invested-in security firm. It all came from her. "You had my pregnant wife abducted," Tobias said, each word landing like a hammer blow in the silent room. He picked up his phone, his movements stiff, robotic. He dialed a number. Zoe's eyes widened in terror. "Who are you calling?" "Tobias, don't. We can fix this. We can leave. Go to the Caymans. We have the money." Tobias didn't answer. He waited for the person on the other end to pick up. "Detective Morrison," he said, his voice a dead monotone. "My name is Tobias Granger. I have information about the disappearance of my wife, Coraline Granger, and I have the person responsible for it right here with me." Zoe let out a guttural scream of denial and rage as Tobias stood there, phone to his ear, watching the complete and utter destruction of the world he had built. He had lost his wife, his child, his fortune, and now he had finally found the truth. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within 30 minutes, the penthouse was swarming with Chicago PD detectives. Zoe Chandler, hysterical and protesting, was led away in handcuffs, her silk robe a pathetic contrast to the cold steel of the cuffs. Her confession to Tobias, coupled with the video evidence in Frank Miller's investigation into Titan Security, was more than enough. Faced with kidnapping charges and a mountain of evidence, one of the two men from the video, a low-level thug named Kevin, cracked under interrogation. He confessed everything. Zoe had paid them $10,000, the same $10,000 Coraline had withdrawn, likely to pay them off herself in a desperate, failed attempt to control the situation, to intimidate Coraline. But Coraline had fought back fiercely. She had tried to use her phone to call 911. In the struggle, she fell and hit her head. Panicked that they had seriously injured or killed her, they'd bundled her into the van and taken her to a secluded, forgotten hunting cabin owned by Kevin's uncle in rural Wisconsin, unsure of what to do next. A multi-state tactical team descended on the cabin's location. They found Coraline in a locked room. She was weak, dehydrated, and had a concussion, but she was alive. And miraculously, impossibly, the baby was safe. The image of Coraline, pale but resolute, being helped out of the cabin by paramedics was broadcast on every news channel. The story of the runaway wife was instantly, violently corrected. She was a survivor, a victim of a scheme so cruel it shocked the city. For Tobias, the world had been stripped down to its raw, unforgiving foundations. He did exactly what David Chen's letter demanded. He fired Garrett Sloan. He hired a new, more sober legal team whose first instruction was to cooperate fully with all authorities. He transferred the full $85 million back from the Caymans into an escrow account controlled by Coraline's lawyer. He publicly funded Frank Miller's now concluded investigation, issuing a public statement taking full responsibility for his moral failings and his blindness to the web of deceit spun around him. He was spared criminal charges for the financial fraud thanks to his cooperation and David Chen's strategic decision to hold back the evidence from the feds in exchange for the settlement. But the court of public opinion was merciless. The name Granger was no longer synonymous with success. It was synonymous with scandal, cruelty, and greed. Major investors pulled out of his firm. Key employees resigned, ashamed to be associated with him. Granger Capital, his life's work, was gutted, a hollowed-out shell of its former glory. He lost the penthouse. He lost his reputation. He lost his fortune, with more than half of what remained going to Coraline in the divorce settlement, which was finalized quietly and quickly. He was a pariah in the city he once ruled. A few weeks later, he tried to see Coraline. He went to the secure, private home her settlement money had bought her in a quiet suburb. He just wanted to see her, to apologize, to somehow explain the inexplicable. But it was Rebecca Shaw who met him at the door. "She doesn't want to see you, Tobias," Rebecca said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Is she okay? The baby?" he asked, his voice cracking. "They're both healthy. She's a strong woman, stronger than you ever knew." "I know," he whispered. "Rebecca, please just tell her I'm sorry, for everything." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment, seeing the broken man before her. "She knows, Tobias, but sorry doesn't fix it. She's focusing on her future now, on her daughter." "Her daughter?" "She had a little girl last week. She named her Hope." The word hit Tobias harder than any court judgment. Hope, the one thing he had systematically destroyed, and the one thing Coraline had managed to carry with her through it all. He nodded, unable to speak, and turned away. He never saw Coraline again. His life became a quiet, solitary affair. He was a millionaire no more, just a man haunted by the ghosts of what he'd had and what he'd thrown away. Coraline, on the other hand, thrived. With her sister Sophie by her side, she raised her daughter far from the glare of the city. She used her intelligence not for algorithms and trading, but for philanthropy, establishing a foundation that helped women and children escaping abusive situations. She had been through the fire and emerged not just intact, but forged into something stronger. She had lost a husband, but she had found herself. And in the end, she and her daughter Hope were the ones who had truly won. The fall of Tobias Granger serves as a powerful and chilling lesson in moral accounting. It's a testament to the fact that no amount of wealth can shield you from the consequences of your own character, and no lie can remain buried forever. Tobias built a towering empire of glass and steel, but he tragically failed to recognize the true foundation holding it all up: the integrity, brilliance, and loyalty of Coraline. He traded a genuine partner for a beautiful parasite, and in that fateful choice, he authored his own spectacular destruction. Zoe Chandler's arc is a classic tale of how greed, left unchecked, curdles into true malice, a short-sighted and desperate grasp for a life she felt entitled to, which ultimately led her to a prison cell. But the real heart of this story, the part that will linger long after the details of the scandal fade, is Coraline's quiet and profound triumph. Her victory wasn't just in the courtroom or the bank account. It was in the complete reclamation of her narrative. She refused to be the victim they tried to make her. Instead, she became the master strategist, the protector, the survivor who proved her greatest assets were never on any corporate balance sheet: her intellect, her foresight, and the fierce, unyielding love for her unborn child. She didn't just survive, she built a new legacy of hope from the very ashes of the life they tried to burn down. This complex web of deceit leaves us with so many questions. Where do you believe the ultimate blame lies? Was Tobias a villain from the start, or a man corrupted by the intoxicating power of his own success? And what was the most shocking twist for you? The brilliant checkmate of the letter, or the horrifying truth revealed in that grainy video footage? We would love to hear your full take on this incredible story in the comments section below. Your perspective is what makes this community thrive. If you believe in the power of stories where justice, however delayed, finally prevails, please show your support by giving this video a thumbs up and sharing it with someone who appreciates a story of ultimate resilience. And to ensure you never miss our next deep dive, please hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. Thank you for listening.